All right, Kruptos. Welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing really, really well. Thank you for having me back, Jay. It's a pleasure to be on.
I'm very happy to have you on again. It's funny, I was talking to my wife about this. I actually don't know how many times I've had you on. She asked me, and the answer I gave her was somewhere between 2 and 6 times. I
I
think that's
think this
accurate.
is 4 or 5, I think.
See, exactly, somewhere between 2 and 6. I knew it was more than one, but
Well, and
anyway.
sometimes they kind of run together too because there's been spaces, and I unfortunately have just your timing for spaces has been atrocious in terms of lining up with when it's convenient for me. But as you know, I'm not the umbilicus Monday, and
Well, I'll put it
that's
this way.
that's
The
okay.
reason the reason those are so inconvenient is because I'm hosting a space on company time, as it were,
On the
and
road.
so they're dead in the middle of the workday.
I can't imagine like trying to drive and manage a space at the same time is just like it's all manners of throwing caution to the wind.
Well, I'll put it this way. If I am killed in a car accident, I will have died how I lived. Uh,
With a smile on his face.
yeah, talking to anonymous accounts on the internet.
Oh my word! That wow.
But anyway, the purpose
Yeah,
of the
there'll
show
be a
is
there'll be a
not
space and
to.
there'll be a big crunch, and you'll like everybody like, "What happened to Jay? Is he okay?"
That would be honestly, I may do that if I ever just get bored of the show. If I ever just decide to
Have
end
a
it all,
sound effect.
just fake my own death by just putting a massive car crash into a space and never posting again.
Oh my word! I'm
Or
sorry.
even better,
Oh, that would be too funny. Oh, okay, there we go.
I've really let the cat out of the bag. I might
Yeah,
actually, be just killed in some freak accident. Now no one will believe it. They're like, oh, he's
yeah,
in
please,
Bermuda.
yeah, please don't do that. Yeah.
I've set up my own Jimmy Hoffa arc, where no one
Oh,
will
yeah, there
believe
you
I'm
go.
actually gone.
Well,
So anyway,
no, it's probably even more like what is it? The guy from the Doors, and you just or Elvis, right? It's like, is he really alive or isn't he?
they're just constant sightings. I like this idea actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jay Burden was spotted in downtown Baghdad. You
Yeah,
know,
exactly. Pictures of me with
Hey,
Jay at a cafe in Taiwan, Thailand, or something. Yeah.
this is a
Oh my
great
God.
idea. I've really this is the whole reason I got a podcast is to
Yeah.
create an elaborate situation to fake my own death.
But the key is monetizing it.
I haven't figured that out. I was on Timeline Earth, and they were saying that they've really done a good job of finding a freakish audience and then monetizing them. And I think I'm really
Oh,
0 for 2. Most of the people I've met have been too normal, and they don't pay me any money, which is really
that was a good
suboptimal.
episode, by the way. That was a good episode, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It was a blast. Those guys are so
Oh
much
my word.
fun to talk to.
Yeah, it
Uh,
was out there, but it was fun.
that's probably an understatement. I Yeah, anyway. So we're actually not here to talk about me being killed in a car crash or faking my own death. We're actually here to
Yeah.
talk about Ellul, which is slightly more heady than any of that.
Well, yeah, and it's depressing, so it's good that you begin with a laugh. But yeah, so this is the thing is I finished finally for reading for the third time through, and now actually taking some serious note, just not an occasional quote here or there, of Jacques Ellul's propaganda. And I finished that this afternoon, and returned the copy. They're very hard to get copies. I mean, I guess you can still buy them in paperback, but I had a nice hardcover with all kinds of annotations from years of other people reading it, and I returned it to the library this afternoon. But so I'm planning on writing some pieces, but I haven't got around there. So we're going to kind of just talk about, article creation. Sort of this is the making the sausage. So sort of thinking it through. And I went over my notes and just made a sort of a handful of couple things that I thought might be important and might be interesting for you. It's just in terms of an introductory way to propaganda and sort of what is it in that regard. So, and yeah, so this is sort of one of the two major things that Ellul is really known for is his work on like the technological society and his other book on propaganda, which if my the philosophy professor who introduced him to me is correct, I believe he is that Ellul wrote propaganda and did the research on it after his experiences during World War II. I guess the story goes is that he went to Germany in the 30s and listened to speeches from the Austrian painter and witnessed many of those crowds firsthand, and found even himself being very compelled by them. And then, in the war and afterwards, began to ask himself questions of how all of this happened. And that's where he ended up, deep diving into the whole subject of propaganda. And his book, Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes, still remains in many ways one of the standard texts on the subject.
All right. So how do you want to approach this? What do you think is the most relevant place to start?
Probably, maybe just to begin sort of in a sense of framing it. So we tend to look at propaganda as, the common image is you have this, these manipulators behind the scenes, sort of these master, the Goebbels types, right? That are, you have some sort of master manipulator behind the scenes, and he's pulling the strings, and what he's doing is trying to make people believe lies. And what Ellul spends several hundred pages doing is disabusing you of that notion, that although there are people that do manipulate the messages, Ellul wants you to understand that propaganda is a necessary sociological phenomenon of the technological society. So that it arises as part of the technological system, in a sense, because in this way, how do you put it, that the technological society, as it begins to emerge in the French Revolution and then through the period of industrialization, as industrialization happens and as the technological society develops, one of the side effects is that it begins to break down society, and it begins to create alienation within the society. So people are, the old household way of organizing society is broken down. People have to come into the cities and sell their labor, and they're packed into these cities, and they're rootless. They're in many ways already, the process of deracination has begun. And what happens then is that this alienation that people feel between each other, between themselves and their labor, and even between people and themselves, gets resolved in many ways through mass media. And so propaganda becomes the instrument by which you are reconnected to society. So the technological society breaks down all of these pre-existing bonds as the function of its growth and its generation through technology, through the capitalist economic system. All of these things work together to break down the natural organic bonds that men have. And so people are now in a society, they're isolated, they're alone, they're alienated, they're without community, without real roots, without organic relationships. And it is by means of propaganda that these isolated individuals, alienated from each other, from themselves, from their work, are then reconnected to each other. But they're not actually reconnected in the old way, in the organic way. They're always connected, in a sense, vertically to the propaganda, and then made to feel like they're connected to something larger. So you don't actually connect sort of on the ground with real people, but you connect to real people. You connect to people through the propaganda as part of the mass. So even though you feel like you belong to something, you're never actually overcome the situation of being alone. And so that's kind of the groundwork, in a sense, because without propaganda, you can't then function in a modern technological society. And so this is the thing that Ellul notes with propaganda, is that propaganda is not about primarily how you think, but it's about what you do. So do you keep participating in the technological society in a way that is required to make the technological society work? So everything from, you know, the idea even of something like a 40-hour work week, which is like completely alien and really doesn't exist until the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, it's not that people didn't work hard in the past, but they worked hard when they needed to, and then they didn't work when they didn't need to work. And there wasn't this sort of regulated, regimented, you know, what we now call the Protestant work ethic, all these kind of things. So you have all of these, and propaganda, the idea of it is to conform you to this modern technological system. So the idea is that propaganda makes you serve the system. And so that's the goal of propaganda, is to get you to serve. And then your thinking will always follow your actions, in a sense, as a way of justifying your actions. And so what Ellul argues is that the messaging of propaganda, it's a mass media phenomenon and can't exist without mass media, can't exist without mass society. Requires a fair degree of density in society. So if you have a rural society, like you would think like pre-industrial society, you can't propagandize it because people are not close enough, not connected enough to each other. But it's also built upon certain fundamental presuppositions, which are, you know, and how does it go? That he says it's built basically upon sort of the modern, what we call modern, almost like progressive mindset. So that the four foundational presuppositions of the modern world that propaganda is built on is that man's aim in life is happiness, that man is naturally good, that history develops in endless progress, and everything is matter. And that within this, you know, he says, from these foundations are built a number of basic myths. The myth of work as almost like a kind of salvific, you know, in a sense, you're saved by working. So you have to go into work every day. You have to be dutiful, do your bit. And this is what keeps society going, that you'll be happy in a sense of, you know, we talk about it with a social phenomenon. You can't just give people like UBI or whatever, because, well, that deprives them of work. They need to work in order to feel meaning in their life. Well, that's basically the myth of work at work. Then he talks about the myth of happiness, that you should be happy, that you should pursue happiness. And then he talks about a bunch of other myths, like the myth of the nation. So the idea of a whole nation is a myth that's built out of propaganda. The myths of youth, and what he calls the myth of the hero. And then he says, all based on all of these myths, the propaganda builds a world for us that enables us to function in the modern world. So it really is, propaganda is a function of the, you know, sort of in a sense, the liberal, progressive, industrial, technological society. And it's the kind of the glue that keeps everything going and moving. And it's in that sense, as a social phenomenon. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to ask about in that regard. I can just kind of keep going, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. So there's several things I want to jump into.
Sure.
First is the point that you made about the point of propaganda is to drive action, because
Yes.
I think that there is an idea derived from certain Enlightenment thinkers that effectively the part of you that is you, right, the kind of like thing that's worth talking about is the reason, right? Actually, you see this even in kind of American Puritans, right? As I did an episode recently with Bagby on, right? Who are very, very concerned that, you know, in getting your, you know, sort of reasonable, like your sorry, not your reasonable, your reason to grapple with and submit to God, right? That is the sum and total of that society. And then to look at propaganda, right, and say that propaganda is not to convince the reason, but is to motivate action, and reason will follow that, I think is a very different take on kind of where is the center of man. So why does Ellul say that is the point of propaganda? And do you see the distinction I'm making with
Oh
a
yeah.
more Protestant Enlightenment view, and then what we can say is Ellul's?
Well, and this is in a sense like an understanding of it. It's basically we tend to think that if you can convince a person of, and you see this in the Republican Party, if you have the right ideas, people's actions will follow because they'll be convinced of the ideas. And what Ellul says is that is a mistaken understanding of how um, messaging and also convincing masses of people really works. And this is also one of the things that changed my understanding of evangelism, in a sense, to look at it, the idea of the elite theory of social change, where social change, even in a society that's not propagandistic, is also mimetic. In a sense, people will imitate their betters, and that if you have your social tastemakers are behaving and projecting a certain way of life, people will want to imitate them because they'll see themselves those kinds of ideas as aspirational, and so they will act in a way that is like the elites. And so in this sense, propaganda takes these basic impulses of this mimetic desire to imitate your betters, and then turns it into a kind of technological system. And so one of the things he notes as well is that, and I think I tweeted this out the other day, is that propaganda replaces the leader. So that we often wonder, like, where is the leaders in society? How can Biden be president and it looks like nobody's in control? Well, the function that a leader would take, that gentleman on the bully pulpit with charisma who leads the society, um, is in some ways not necessary when propaganda is there. So propaganda becomes um, the elite that people all imitate. And so then you create, through cohesive messaging, by surrounding them constantly with messages, you create a kind of life that you want people to imitate, and then their thinking will follow and justify their actions. So that's that sense of, now people talk about it from a Christian perspective. If you have elite tastemakers who are all devout, faithful Christians, and people see that as a way to advance themselves in society, even if they don't necessarily believe at first, they will begin to act in such a way because they'll see it in their interest that this is the way to advance in society, is to act like a Christian. And then what will happen is that they will justify their actions by changing the way they think. And eventually the changing the way they think and genuine faith and belief kind of collapses into the two. And the difference between sort of authentic and inauthentic just begins to erase itself. And that's, in a non-propagandistic way, in a healthy society, that's kind of how it works. But again, like I say, propaganda replaces the leader. And now in the technological society, all you need then are managers. Propaganda becomes the leader, and then everybody else is just sort of managing that reality that's created. And so you then imitate the messages, the images, the themes. And so you see this with people on television, right? So this is why all these images, people sort of, they act and behave like the people that they see on television, because that's the mimetic model that's given to them. And so this is then that sort of that top-down messaging. Those are the quote unquote the elites that they imitate. Those are the messages that drive society. And it's not so much driving thought, but then driving action, and then thought follows in that sense to justify and to make one's actions make sense. You just simply believe that your actions are good and part of a larger, moral fabric, that you're a good person by behaving the way that you're behaving. You make it cohere in your own mind. In a sense, propaganda allows you to remove the contradictions of your own behavior, and it creates that kind of internal moral cohesiveness between action and thought.
It's very much, it reminds me of, Moldbug's conception of the cathedral, in the sense that,
Yes.
there is no Dr. Evil sitting at the
No.
top of this system, right? Obviously, there are bad actors. We can identify them, but this isn't Star Wars. You can't blow
No.
up the Death Star and win, right? And it's interesting that your that phrase you said, propaganda becomes the leader, because it very much reminds me of his conception of a media-driven state, right?
Yes.
Where effectively everyone is driven by narrative. And
And
there's a
even the
whole
narrative makers are driven by the narrative.
exactly, and there's a whole chapter of the kind of center right that is primarily interested in combating postmodernism, and I have absolutely no idea what they mean when they say that, other than anyone who isn't, a 90s liberal, right? Uh, but within that, right, you can look at that and say, well, oh, that's a conception of narrative that is very postmodern, but it is very much not of the left. And I realize it's a very vague question, but where do you see the desire for the center right to skewer postmodernism? And do you think it's something that is inherently leftist or inherently kind of entropic?
Well, the problem with um, the center right is that they're working from a conception of the world and the system that they live in that is false. And so in that sense, they're ineffectual because they believe their own lies. And this is one of the things that Ellul talks about. And there's a number of things when we talked about this before, that there's no spiritual core there. There's nothing like genuinely there. It's more of a belief in the system that if we can ward off the scary things from either side, we can maintain a belief in the system itself as the system, and that the rules of the system will protect us from having to grapple with the idea that there may not be any rules. And this is the thing that propagate or that postmodernism confronts you with, is this sense of what grounds society. And that's another whole argument altogether. And that would be, my argument for why eventually if the right is going to emerge as a force, it's going to have to be Christian, because the only thing that really grounds, and this is, I know for some listeners maybe like bizarre, but the only thing that actually truly grounds meaning is in the supernatural presence of God. That sense of the Lord set on high, and these experiences being real. Other than that, you're basically, it's just all power and the exercise of human power and human decision. And so if there's something outside of ourselves that grounds us, you have to have access to it. And that's those metaphysical realities. And so if there's nothing, and this is the thing that the center believes, is that reason grounds us, but it doesn't. And they refuse to believe the sense that power grounds us. And so they struggle to grapple with the reality of the world as it is. And that's really kind of where the problem is. It's frightening because they want to retreat to a world that's safe, where they believe that it's grounded in reason, and reason really can't ground anything. That's basically Alistair McIntyre, definitively kind of burst that bubble. So that's what is it? What was his book? After
liberalism
Virtue?
or?
No, After
Sorry.
Virtue, I think that's the one, I think. After Virtue. But yeah. So, and then, when you get into we think, well, why is propaganda, can't you have like a right-wing propaganda? And it said, well, no, because propaganda is a function of the system itself. And this is the thing, that it has to be in harmony with the system itself. So this propagandist mindset, this world has grown up with the system as we know it. It's in a sense, and this is why he talks about it as a sociological phenomenon. It's part of the technological world. And this is where he says a propaganda, this is like a quote, right? A propaganda that stresses virtue over happiness and presents man's future as one dominated by austerity and contemplation would have no audience at all. A propaganda that questions progress or work would arouse disdain and reach nobody. So, and this is really the problem that in many ways the right faces, is that propaganda is closed off to us. So it in some ways, if you want messaging that works, it has to tap into the themes of system. Like, so, your boomer posting, right? Why does your boomer posting work? Because from an irony level, it exposes all of the core messages that float around in the zeitgeist that propaganda has to adhere to in order to make it work. And so the one things that sort of mid-century consensus did is it grabs onto all of these themes that are out there in the zeitgeist that are part of the basic mythos of Western society, Western of the idea of human progress, whatever, and then latches onto it and then makes these and reinforces those messages and makes them the key thing that sort of drives our action. And so if you in irony sort of poke at all of these, we can sit back and laugh because they're hilarious, because you can, if you take a step back, they're funny. But then to propose messaging that is really different or counter to those, you can sense in a sense it doesn't go anywhere, because it doesn't reflect the basic message of, all people are equal. If you work hard, you can get ahead. If democracy matters, your vote matters. The rule of law matters. All of these types of basic myths that have been promulgated to us. If your messaging adheres to that, then it becomes part of the system and people accept it. And it allows it to sort of shape their actions going forward. And that's kind of one of the struggles that the right has, is that they're swimming, like the true right has, is that they're swimming against the grain of the technological society. And and propaganda functions as part of that technological society.
Yeah, I think it's always something that I struggle with when I'm talking to Burnhamites, right? People in that tradition. And look, I've taken a lot from James Burnham. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. But to me, abstracting power to a neutral force is useful in some context, right? Viewing it like you would discuss, economics or hydrology, right? Something that doesn't have kind of a moral weight to it. However, that's sort of a limited prism. And I think this is something that Haywood is very good at, is sort of drawing the distinction between, the left and the right, order and chaos, entropy and, actual, like, a constructive society. And so I think when you look at something like propaganda, it's a very interesting question of, well, can that be used by us and our friends, right? And from a certain perspective, yes, right? We have to be, winsome. We have to kind of message and use, maybe not propaganda, but rhetoric might be a better way to say it, right? We have to be convincing. But at the same time, I don't know if that's the same thing as the type of propaganda that you're discussing.
No, because it's, in a sense of running a TV show with, somebody talking is not the same. Propaganda is a holistic system, in a sense that it totally encompasses the person. In that sense, like Heidegger's, it enframes you. So you are no longer able to actually encounter reality on your own outside of the messaging of propaganda. That your every action is directed by the sea of messaging that you're in, right? And so this is a thing that Ellul notes. He talks about it this way. He talks about the means are more important than the ends, which is basically a way of saying, like Marcia McLuhan, the medium is the message in this sense. So what Ellul is saying is that, like a television set, it doesn't matter what program is on the television set as long as people are watching television in that regard. So in a sense, and this is why he says that propaganda in some ways has to be non-ideological. It's a function of the system, right? So as long as people are serving the system and they're obediently serving the system, the messaging itself doesn't matter, because what's more important is that, in a sense, if you use the analogy of the television, it's more important than they watch television than it is what they watch. And so it really doesn't matter. As long as they're serving propaganda, they're still propagandized people, and you're not free from propaganda. And this is the other danger that I guess that you run into of trying to use counter propaganda, is that it's still propaganda, and that people are still broken down, alienated, and then controlled. And that's really the danger, in a sense, of what you would call, the idea of maybe creating right-wing propaganda, is that it's still propaganda. So whether it's left-wing propaganda or right-wing propaganda, all propaganda is propaganda, and it has the same effects on the human psyche without it. So there is this sense of but you run into the tank problem, and maybe this is a way of segueing into the problem of, and as Ellul spends, I think, 4 or 5 pages in the book specifically talking about the effect of propaganda on the church, right? So he talks about the Christian faith as it's primarily about in a sense, almost overcoming the alienation between God and man. So the idea is connecting spiritually with God, right? And so that's the goal. So he says you're really caught in a bind, because if you say, as a Christian, we're not going to do propaganda, what happens is that your congregants are in a society that the moment they leave the church building, they're bombarded with propagandistic messages. And in the face of that, what happens is people get sucked into the propaganda message, and your spiritual connection with God doesn't have the same kind of technical power that the machine has, right? That's sort of that materialist machine. So then you think to yourself, oh, well, we as Christians, we're going to use propaganda. We can make it serve the gospel, right? So, but he says that the dangers is that people who are manipulated by propaganda become impervious to spiritual realities, because remember, they're built on the materialism. And so once if somebody is inframed in propaganda, they're inframed in technical realities. They're not suited. In some sense, you actually ruin them for the spiritual life. And this is part of the problem that being in the technological society with propaganda is it makes it very, very hard for us to have an actual spiritual life, because the propaganda cuts us off from that part of ourselves, because it can't allow it. And it, sense, ruins our ability to actually connect with God. So you can, religion, by accessing myths, you can use all the tools of propaganda. Is that if the church gives into propaganda, Christians can use mass media, you can use propaganda techniques, you can try to hack the system for Christ. But what ends up happening is that people stop being spiritual. So you can grow churches, you can make Christianity very, very successful, but the problem is that then Christianity ceases to be a spiritual power, and it becomes compromised, sort of, as Ellul says, in all of its actions. Christianity adapts to the prevailing milieu, and it serves people's needs. It functions as a kind of hoax, but then all it does is try to meet and change people's material needs, but it doesn't actually connect them with spiritual realities. So what ends up happening is that Christianity becomes an ideology. It has doctrine, it has doctrinary ideas, it has things that you do. You have praxis, and people are told what to do, how to live their lives. They are told how to think and given the right thoughts, but they are utterly cut off from God. And so he says the process of embracing propaganda turns the Christian faith into just another ideology. So he says you're really caught between a rock and a hard place, because if you don't use it, your congregants are sort of at the mercy of the propagandists from the technological society, and then you have that effect anyways. But if you use it on your people, you end up with the same effects, but they're just now a Christianized version of the same person that would have been a secularized version. So he says this is kind of the tank problem of propaganda and the Christian faith, and it's very, very hard to escape from this. So, either way, you're in real trouble as a Christian church, and this is, in a sense, you can see its effects on us all, as Christians all around us. And that's one of the observations that I have made to myself, in a sense. Our Christian faith today in many ways feels like an ideology, and Ellul tells us kind of why it does, is because in many ways we as Christians have embraced the tools of propaganda to grow churches and to expand our numbers.
It reminds me of the sort of old time gospel hour style of kind of propagandized preaching, right? And look, like I have a certain affection for those sort of people, so I'm not trying to be overly dismissive, but it's sort of the media of radio sort of ate those churches, right? It became the thing. In much the same way that when we saw, evangelism go to television, right? Oh, what was it called? Was it called the 100 Club? This was well before my time.
100 Huntley Street, and I think I know the shows that you're talking about.
Well, and again, for those who aren't familiar, a lot of these were extremely, kind of charismatic pastors that would hold these sort of kind of like, live church services, right? Oftentimes, I mean, this is the birth of the phrase televangelist, right?
That's right.
And within that, going back to that idea in McLuhan, right, that the media is the message, right? Obviously, like from a certain perspective, like if you were just sort of reading a highlight of the transcript, you'd be like, okay, well, this is a relatively, shall we say, conservative interpretation of scripture. Again, relative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But look at what the effects of that were, right?
Yes.
Not only was there an immense cheapening of it, right? It became, kind of a transaction, but also you're taking worship, you're taking, church, right? And turning it into sort of a passive media experience, right? You were
which is what propaganda wants to do. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly my point. And so I think that's sort of the example of the trend you were identifying.
That's it. That's exactly it. And this is one of the things that propaganda does, is it makes you entirely passive. You're at the mercy of the propagandist. He tells you what to do, how to think, and in order to resolve the internal contradictions of you believing that you're a free person, you then take on the beliefs as your own. And and this is the real danger. I mean, propaganda in the end alienates you from yourself, because your thoughts are not your own, but they are formed by the propagandist, and you're told sort of what to think, what to believe, how to act, what to do. And it creates the world for you. And maybe this is the good way to sort of segue into, from the churches into the relationship between propaganda and democracy and the democratic system, because we tend to look at that as sort of the foundation for human liberty, right? So we, begin with the idea that, each person is a free person, able to make their own choices. They are self-determining, and you should. Nothing should, in a sense, impinge upon your ability to make your own choices and to live your own life and to act as a free person. And that's probably the extreme version, or the libertarian, outtake of it. But these ideas, are out there in the zeitgeist. But what Ellul argues is that, first of all, the individual isolated from the community is ripe for propaganda. So you become sort of the perfect victim of the propagandist once you're an isolated individual. People who are in strong, thick communities are very, very difficult to propagandize. The people that are the easiest to propagandize are isolated individuals, alone and alienated in a city, who believe that they're free, believe that they're free actors, believe that they're making their own choices. These are the people that can be manipulated the most easily. So you have this situation where you have this belief in parliamentary democracy, in the vote, And this idea of a society-wide vote to give expression to the voice of the people, the will of the people, he says is already a mass phenomenon. So democracy itself, as it grows up with modernity, as it grows up with the technological society, with industrialization, democracy as a mass phenomenon is a product of this whole ethos of the technological, of this modern society. And it is formed and shaped with it as it grows up out of the 1700s and so forth. So as a mass phenomenon, though, you have this problem of how do you motivate the masses to vote in the ways that you're hoping they're doing. How do you get them to vote for your party? How do you get them to vote for your cause? How do you get them to vote in the ways that you hope that they'll vote? Well, you have to use the methods of motivating masses of people, which is in a sense propaganda. So you begin with the printing press, you begin with the newspapers, and then eventually you add, radio and television and the internet, but you begin with all of these masses. So you reach people through media of mass communication, you forge them into groups, and it now requires propaganda. So you have these groups that are then beginning to be forged by propaganda, and layering alongside of this, so in a sense, the process of democracy almost requires and necessitates propaganda in order to make it work. So then you layer this also with the myth of the marketplace of ideas. So you have democracy, you have this mass of people who then believe that in the interplay of all of these individuals spouting ideas out, that somehow the best ideas will emerge and will reign victorious, and the best ideas will show themselves and the truth will emerge. And so what Ellul argues is in that model is that triumph is truth. In other words, the idea that is victorious is the true idea. That's basically what the marketplace of ideas tells you, is that the victorious idea is truth. In other words, we always joke, the victor writes history. Well, in the sense of the marketplace of idea, the victorious idea is truth. And so once you realize, well, okay, the victorious idea is truth, well, then really the power to shape the victorious idea determines what truth is. So then what Ellul says is that power shapes truth. And in a society that, how do you exercise power in a modern mass society? Well, you exercise it through technical means. And what is the technical means of shaping ideas? Well, the means of exercising power to shape ideas is propaganda. So what Ellul argues is that in a democratic society, propaganda is truth. And you can, and this is just the way that the people, the way that it functions in society. Propaganda is truth. And because it's an all-encompassing system, there's no way to break out of it. Now, it uses all of the catchwords of the system. So it uses words like, like liberty and freedom and all the rest of these sort of catchwords, rights and democracy and the individual. You use all these catchwords to make people feel like they're actually doing the thing that the myths say they're doing, when in fact, the democratic system demands a totalitarian propaganda system, propagandistic, ethos in order to make itself work. So in this sense, what Ellul argues is that the very idea of mass democracy requires totalitarianism in order to make it work. Because of the necessity, just all of sort of the underlying assumptions just lead you sort of step by step by step to sort of a sense of a mass democracy, in a sense, in order to work, requires that it be a totalitarian propagandic system. And then once where you believe that you're free, and that's the funny thing, sort of the internal contradiction. You believe that you're free when in fact you're enframed within a totalitarian system. And basically, the propaganda is truth, and you're not allowed to escape from this reality. So that's kind of, and this is, it's a frightening kind of argument, but that's basically where modern life is, and this is why he calls it a sociological phenomenon and not so much, something that's done to you. It's just part of the necessity of modern life that we need propaganda to make the whole thing work.
So,
Yeah.
Kruptos, we are fast coming up on time. This was really fascinating, and the reason I'm still trying to wrap my head
I
around
know.
this. I may need to have you on for a part two when
Well,
I
I'll be
am.
writing some pieces, so there might be justification for that. But yeah, thanks for letting me ramble so much here
Oh,
too. It's
sure.
just it's a big topic that is just it's beyond like 45 minutes to an hour to really even encompass all of it. It's there's just so much there that you could bore into.
So, if someone did want to find that article and perhaps others, where should they look for them?
Yeah. Well, they won't find this article probably for a couple of weeks. So I got a couple more to make, and I got to get myself organized in terms of how I want to approach this. But they will show up eventually. You can find me on my Substack, and it's called seekingthehiddenthing.com, seekingthehiddenthing.com. And that's where most of my serious work is. And then my Twitter feed, which is, @_Kruptos. That's a mix of some serious stuff and the more juvenile, lighthearted things. But we do also I've been dropping little hints on propaganda for months now as I've been working through this book. And so hopefully we can put it together into something bigger. So yeah, seekingthehiddenthing.com and @_Kruptos.
Well, again, I highly recommend your Substack. It's one of the ones that I make a rule out of reading. And again, thank you so much for coming on. This was
Well,
a
thank you.
fascinating discussion.
You're welcome. Thank you
As
for
far
having
as
me.
my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. And remember, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.